of Transnationally Asian Conference. And basically today's session will be discussing our relationship with empire. Yes, a very heavy topic and of course pretty historical, and we have a pretty star-studded set of panelists today. And just to give you a little idea about what's going on, we'll be discussing the Asian subject's relationship with empire on a transnational scale, and we're going to ask each of our panelists how this would be understood from the lenses of contemporary media, and they will be drawing upon their own context of the history of empire and anti-imperial resistance in their specific regions, how this history influences the present, and a little bit about post-colonial solidarity in the 21st century and how do their media organizations facilitate this kind of transnational solidarity. So let's just get to the Zoom etiquette for now before we kick off with starting with Dr. Thum Tjin. So first and foremost, please type comments and questions in the chat box. Questions for Q&A can be sent in the group chat or directly to the moderator, which is me, Netusha. The event will be recorded and the recording shared on social media. If you do not wish to be included in the recording, please enter a pseudonym while in the call and keep your camera turned off. Be kind, be generous. We are all living through stressful times. If you act in a way that is disruptive to other participants, we will have no choice but to remove you from the Zoom event. Also, if you'd like to engage on this panel session and discussion over your social media, please use the hashtag Transnationally Asian and tag accounts such as New Naratif, Lausan HK, and New Bloom Mag. And if you're interested, New Naratif is offering a discount for subscriptions. So you may use the coupon code Transnationally Asian for a 15% discount for their annual memberships, valid for only a week until this Sunday. All right, so let's get to it right now. Okay, so we're going to start off with Dr. P.J. Thum, who is the Managing Director of New Naratif and Founding Director of Project Southeast Asia, an interdisciplinary research center on Southeast Asia at the University of Oxford. His work centers on Southeast Asian governance and politics. His most recent work is Living with Myths in Singapore, co-edited with Loh Ka-Seng and Jack Chia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome PJ to talk about New Naratif and a little bit about the topic at hand today.
Thank you, Netusha. Hi, everyone. My name is PJ Thum. I am wearing a yellow, green, and gray batik shirt and standing in front of a bunch of bookshelves of books, and my pronouns are he, him. Thank you very much to the organizers and to my fellow panelists and to the moderator, Netusha. The point that I want to make today is that the assumptions underlying the media institutions in Singapore, and indeed our entire modern political, social, economic systems and institutions are generally based on colonial assumptions and values. And until we address those assumptions and values and query and criticize them and not reproduce them uncritically, we cannot solve the problems that those institutions are designed to address. For example, Southeast Asian governments and legal systems are direct adaptations, often modeled on American, British, Dutch, French political systems, and underpinned by their precedents. The Western neoliberal capitalist consensus dominates and even dictates Southeast Asian economic policies. A lot of Southeast Asian popular culture has been shaped powerfully by American and British models, and even the institutions that we think of as traditional institutions were often adapted in response to colonial interaction, to the colonial encounter. For example, the monarchies of Thailand and Malaysia, both of which were irreversibly shaped in response to or by the colonial encounter, or Islam itself, which underwent reform in the early 20th century in response to the Islamic modernist movement, and which is itself a religion and arrived in Southeast Asia on the wings of trade and commerce. Now, this is not to imply that the colonial encounter was entirely negative, nor to suggest that there is an essentialist Southeast Asian identity. Quite the opposite. I want to emphasize that Southeast Asia's high connectivity means that it has continually been evolving in response to external influence. So calls to throw off the shackles of colonial ideological influence and decolonize the mind, they don't really resonate with the facts of our history. We've always been evolving and changing in response to both internal and external stimuli. There is no traditional Southeast Asia. There is no returning to any sort of essential or true past, no matter how much establishment or conservative interests may insist. Instead, what is needed is for Southeast Asia to form our own conceptions and consensus about our values and beliefs, which are grounded in local context and circumstance, and which can continue to evolve and adapt. These, in turn, will then inform the most critical questions that we confront today. And these include the major challenges of the 20th century, including, most crucially, how we organize our societies, how we organize our economies, and how we organize our politics. We have been unable to answer these questions to our own satisfaction because the values and institutions of our authoritarian government and our establishment interests are based upon or in opposition to, but influenced by colonial forms of thought and reflect the values of a narrow elite rather than the perspectives and lived experience of individual citizens at large. Southeast Asia always keeps being seen as a place which lacks agency, where things happen to us rather than we make things happen. But our history shows that we have so much to offer. Southeast Asia has produced innovative political thoughts, and relatively recently, vigorous and influential debates arose in Thailand, for example, as King Chulalongkorn's reforms challenged the Siamese-centric view of the universe. As Jose Rizal articulated a new form of Filipino identity, which rejected late Spanish colonialism in the late 1890s. In Indonesia, as conservative, Islamic, and socialist movements briefly joined forces. I mean, can you imagine reconciling Islam, communism, and nationalism? But that's what Sukarno did in his study, Islam, Nationalism, Communism, 1926, in their attempts to overthrow Dutch oppression. And of course, in Malaya, as British decolonization approached, and the question of forming a new nation out of very different communities suddenly became imminent. So the world keeps changing. Society needs to reinvent themselves. Societies need to reinvent themselves to remain relevant, and states need to allow innovative ideas to challenge the status quo. This was our response to those challenges, but those debates were then subsequently quashed by post-colonial governments eager to cement their position as the sole arbiter of national identity, a process which reached its most tragic form in the ideological conflict of the 50-year Cold War. So the nation states of Southeast Asia have all been influenced very strongly by the colonial era. And the process of decolonization has, in every single state, required the suppression of legitimate alternative visions of Southeast Asia that sought to move away from the colonial legacy. This included Pan-Southeast Asia movements, Mafilindo, Association of Southeast Asia, Persatuan Malaya Muda's concept of the unified Malay Nusantara, Pan-Islamism, and irredentist or separatist movements, some of which, of course, continue to struggle today. Papua, Rakhine, Sulu State, for example. So today, Southeast Asian governments remain really wary of such debates and their potentially disruptive effects on the authoritarian status quo, because a truly vigorous debate takes ideas on its own merit and does not shy even at questioning the colonial and post-colonial boundaries of Southeast Asian states and or the legitimacy of Southeast Asian institutions. So the Southeast Asian media here has a critical role to play in communicating these new ideas, different visions, in communicating research, local perspectives, making available evidence-based perspectives, and then fostering discussion and debate, exploring alternative visions for Southeast Asia, critiquing abuses of power. But this is not merely a question of a news-driven media. These debates require media with an understanding of Southeast Asian history, culture, anthropology, sociology, in order to situate our understanding in the proper Southeast Asian context. In short, Southeast Asia needs to formulate a Southeast Asian philosophy or philosophies, an understanding of Southeast Asia on Southeast Asian terms. The answers that we may come up with may be exactly the same as the answers we have now, but they would be rooted in our local circumstance. And the values underpinning political and economic processes need to be grounded in the Southeast Asian context and draw upon our own historical experience and culture. And Southeast Asians need the space to imagine a better Southeast Asia and then to act collectively in pursuit of our vision for the future. So that's what New Naratif does or tries to do. We aid this process by providing accurate information based on evidence reflective of the perspectives of the people of Southeast Asia. And we empower the people of Southeast Asia to create positive change in their communities. And we fight for the values that we wish to see and we believe should be part of the Southeast Asian identity. Only through a vigorous, ongoing public debate can the issues we collectively face be properly addressed, and they need to emerge organically through widespread public citizenship engagement and free discussion. Until we do so, we'll always be slaves to colonial thought, fighting in an arena of the mind designed for us by colonial oppressors and an arena inherited by the authoritarian successors, and arena in which we're always subjects to others and never masters for ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, PJ. That was really comprehensive and really interesting. I think I really like this point about wanting to, like the media having this role of actually facilitating a conversation that helps decenter colonial born narratives, right? And to think of how there is no essential conception of Southeast Asia in the first place. But we'll get more to that, I guess, in the Q&A, because I'm quite curious to know how New Naratif tries to decenter conventionally. And I guess I could tell from based on how this conference has been organized and choices of regional partners then suggest a way of problematizing the colonial concept of Southeast Asia. So, okay, thank you very much, PJ. Now, let's go to Wen Liu. Wen Liu is a Taiwanese scholar, educator, and writer currently based in Taipei, Taiwan. She is Assistant Research Fellow at the Institute of Ethnology, Academia Sinica. Her research broadly focuses on queer theory and diasporic Asian American politics. And if some of you are familiar with the work of New Blue Mag, perhaps you have seen many of Wen Liu's really interesting and amazing writings. So without further ado, let's hear from Wen Liu.
Hi, thanks for everyone. Thanks for Natasha's introduction. So good morning from Taipei. So I will start by talking a little bit about how I got involved with New Bloom and kind of how New Bloom really sees these questions around empires. So many of you probably have already heard New Bloom started around 2014 out of the Sunflower movements in Taiwan. And for folks who don't remember, it was a movement that Taiwanese citizens were resisting a package neoliberal trade deal that would let Chinese money to dominate the majority of the Taiwanese economy. But a lot of way in which how the global audiences have seen the struggle, it's as a pro-democracy struggle. And in a way, I think the movement was also pro-democratic, but many don't really see the kind of anti-capitalist, even though it's a small fraction, but it's the anti-capitalist, the more left-leaning vision in that movement. So New Bloom really started in that way. They wanted to provide a more sort of nuanced understanding of Taiwan and Taiwanese movements. So besides that, Brian from New Bloom and I have also involved in organizing around the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal when we were in New York, where there was a lot of the anti-imperialist Asian activists were, from Korea, from Japan, from China were working around this issue. But in that organizing, I think I personally noticed how Taiwanese voices are usually not included in the broader leftist circle because a lot of them would equate Taiwan with capital. So I think this is a lot of struggle that I think Hong Kong activists have also faced, right? When people are looking for radical voices from the Chinese diaspora, they often look for mainland Chinese organizer, but not really thinking about how there are also leftist voices from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, etc. And this kind of argument has also been articulated by, I think, a quite famous book by a Taiwanese intellectual, Chen Guangxin's book of Asia as a Method. But we find that actually quite problematic. I think Brian has written an article about that because it's really arguing that Taiwan has no way out besides a sort of towards a more pro-socialist unification position with China, that Taiwan itself can never be anti-imperial. So we're trying to really build a circle to speak against that kind of idea. And also, I think similar to Lausan's approach, we're trying to find a third route of struggle beyond just siding with the so-called anti-communist hawks, like the Republican Party in the US, which have on the surface seem to be more pro-Taiwan Taiwan independence, or another position that's pro-Chinese Communist Party that is just becoming a new form of Chinese nationalism. So a lot of what we're dealing with is dealing with the tension where the left is often siding with the pro-unification position, rejecting the possibility that Taiwanese independence or Taiwanese self-determination can actually have a radical vision. And also, I think folks might have noticed in this US presidential election, there's a survey that kind of talks about how Taiwan actually have one of the most pro-Trump residents across all Asian societies, even more so than Hong Kong. So I think a lot of Taiwanese folks would tend to see Trump as this savior to Taiwan because he speaks up against the threats of China and he used really vulgar terms against China. But the New Bloom has been trying to critique that kind of idea. I mean, one, because obviously US can always easily betray marginal nations' security that they have promised, such as what just happened in Syria earlier, and they can easily withdraw troops, right, and set the stage for Turkish invasion, for example. Or it also erased how Taiwan indeed has now carried a lot of, I think, democratic and social justice values that should be really seen by the world, but it's being sort of mystified by this sort of pro-Trump mania. So many people, particularly, I think, liberal activists, will criticize our approach of a leftist Taiwanese independence as just not practical, the geopolitical reality that we have to side with the US because they provide the troops, whatnot. But we must be clear, I think, from an anti-capitalist perspective, that the current condition of the US and China relation is really not a result of competing covert ideology, but the change of regime's response to the paradigmic shift amongst the crisis of global capitalism. So just for example, so since the 2008 financial crisis, we have seen both US and China have rapidly moved from their previously more engaging economic relationship to, such as Obama's administration, the pivot to Asia and the Indo-Pacific strategy, trying to secure their own economic and military interests in Asia, or even China's Belt and Road initiative, right? So we have to think about all these measures as their imperial ways to solve their internal debt crisis and counter each other's geopolitical influences, rather than just an ideological rivalry between communism versus, or authoritarianism versus democracy or capitalism. So I think for us to propose a sort of leftist stance on Taiwanese sovereignty or Taiwanese independence, we must really clarify what's at stake for imperial powers, such as the expansion of neoliberal trades, the restriction of economy via the debt financing, assertions of technological dominance, and the creation of control measures over workers and other marginalized communities. So all of these stuff would not be changed by a simple change of leadership in Washington or Beijing. So we must really clarify our strategies based on that. And since I don't have that much time left, but I really want to talk about, I think Taiwan also obviously similar to a lot of struggles in Asia, this kind of non-sovereign condition. But what's really unique about Taiwan is also the indigenous struggles on the island. So Taiwan as a Han settler society, I think I always say our struggle cannot only be anti-imperial, also has to be anti-colonial. So New Bloom has also done some work to really capture indigenous workers' activist work to think about how Taiwanese sovereignty is not a singular version of another sort of Han-dominated Taiwanese nationality, but it has to be multiple. It has to really center on the kind of crisis and the struggles that indigenous people are fighting for. For instance, that we have an article that talks about the indigenous tribes fight for the right to hunt, to kind of secure their own traditional practices, but it's also a different relationship to ecology, to land ownership and whatnot. So I think those struggles should be also front and center in our work in Taiwan, so that our work is not only anti-imperial, but it can also be decolonial. So in all this way, I think we can sort of challenge both the emerging hegemonic Taiwanese ethno-nationalism that's becoming increasingly right-wing, but also the Chinese authoritarianism and the US-led imperialism that's affecting the context we're talking about now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wen Liu. That was really interesting and really contextual. And I really appreciate the fact that you introduced this importance of not falling between binaries. And I think that's like a real issue, especially with the left, and the idea of trying to bring in Taiwan into the conversation of the global left is really necessary. And given that there are new forces right now, like Progressive International and whatnot, I wonder how this could be encouraged. And let's explore that a little bit more in the Q&A later on. But yes, let's go on to our final panelist for this session, JP, who is an organizer and occasional writer for Lausan, a decolonial left Hong Kong news, website or platform. And she is currently based in the UK. So without further ado, let's welcome JP to talk about Lausan and her work.
Cool, thank you so much. Just checking, is the screen sharing working? Is it, I can't see the chat, so. Okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel, and to the co-organizers and Netusha for putting on such an exciting series of events. My name is JP, my pronouns are she, her. And first, just please let me apologize. It's 2 a.m. in the UK, so I have to speak quietly, but please bear with me. So today I'll be speaking about Lausan and our work and our relationship with empire. From the very beginning, Lausan has been engaged with the question of our relationship with empire and global structures of imperialism and colonialism that have shaped material conditions in Hong Kong and elsewhere. In particular, I think our work facilitates understanding of Hong Kong's post-colonial existence, while also opening spaces for articulating decolonial futures. Now, this is a deliberate distinction, the reasons for which I hope will become clear as I go on. But first, I think that we can conceptualize Lausan's work as engaging with the question of empire by providing robust analyses of Hong Kong's post-colonial condition in terms of people's lived experiences. And I think this actually resonates with what PJ was saying earlier about having narratives around Southeast Asia that are rooted in history and also deals with Southeast Asian history and political context on their own terms. I think Lausan tries to do that in the context of Hong Kong, especially in a media landscape that has historically narrativized Hong Kongers' experiences based on reductive East-West, liberal authoritarian binaries, and in which many well-known Hong Kong activists have deliberately employed the frameworks of liberal democracy and neoliberal capitalism in order to make their political demands legible to the West. In this context, what Lausan tries to do is to analyze the continuities between British colonialism and CCP repression, and to look at how authoritarian state power and capitalist extraction have functioned across both regimes to suppress Hong Kongers' freedoms. We try and do this by engaging in a practice of translating outwards, that is, translating Hong Kongers' on-the-ground articulations of their material conditions from Cantonese to English, but more broadly, making those articulations legible to broader audiences. For example, one of the questions we came across last year during the anti-extradition bill movement was why the 5 key demands of the movement were not focused on material redistribution in any way. The reason, as we tried to cover in multiple articles and translations, is that many Hong Kongers believe that greater democratic freedoms within the liberal democratic paradigm are essential to even broach the question of societal inequality and redistribution. And this in itself is due to the way in which the British colonial government sought to depoliticize social and economic issues in response to a series of uprisings in the 1960s, limiting the terrain of political contestation to the electoral realm, which was more easily controllable. Over time, this crystallized into dependence on the framework of liberal democracy in which people can make their demands. And now even this limited framework has been effectively taken away from Hong Kongers by the CCP. But none of this would be intelligible without an initial awareness of the discourse underneath the typical battle between liberal democracy and authoritarianism, as well as an understanding of the history underlying a lot of the discourses that exist on Hong Kong today. Today, in the context of escalated repression via the national security law, we see Hong Kongers appealing to the US and the UK on the streets for liberation, often through sanctions and other such means. I think what Lausan has strived to do is to show how these perhaps misguided demands are actually products of Hong Kongers' tactical engagement as Wen earlier spoke about in terms of this pragmatic approach to global geopolitics. At the same time, we have tried to platform the voices of those who have also been doing the work all along of resisting imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, from migrant justice organizers to rank and file workers, whose voices have been excluded from the mainstream due to barriers of language and also legibility. We've also tried to critique so-called pragmatic approaches in good faith to the end of imagining alternatives. This links to my second point, which is that Lausan aims to help to open up space for imagining decolonial futures. Recognizing that the meaning of decoloniality is always bound to the locale in which it is being articulated, and that many of our understandings within Lausan of decolonization are informed by the work of Indigenous and Black scholars in their specific historical contexts, members of Lausan have continuously wrestled with the general absence of a vocabulary to explain our city's specific predicament. When I say wrestle, I mean this like almost literally, because we've had many long and very protracted discussions about whether we can call ourselves decolonial or not. Nonetheless, today we still use the tagline sharing decolonial left perspectives because we see ourselves as participating in a broader emergent project of articulating what decoloniality looks like from the position of Hong Kong. We do this first through facilitating conversations between Hong Kongers and protesters engaged in struggle in different parts of the world. in a time where there is an unprecedented rise of protest and resistance, we believe that we have a lot to learn from one another, given that, as Joey has put here so eloquently, we are often ground under the same structures of capitalism, imperialism, and histories of colonialism that have put us in the positions we are in today. At the same time, many of our translators are working hard to translate inwards, to make interventions in local discourse based on learnings from international movements, such as resources on abolition and rent strikes, to deepen Hong Kongers' global engagement and solidarity, but also to challenge some of the reactionary and xenophobic tendencies within the movement, such as the erasure of migrant workers and racism towards mainland Chinese people. Ultimately, I think that many Hong Kongers are courageously practicing new forms of politics and solidarities, in spite of not knowing what life would look like beyond the given political and economic system, whether that's in organizing for a general strike, engaging in mutual aid networks, or simply caring for one another in the context of fundamental upheaval. This is similar to dynamics of resistance all over the world. In fact, last year in a panel called Non-Sovereign Revolutions that Wen briefly touched on, and we were on a panel together on last year, Professor Yarimar Bonilla, who studies Puerto Rico and also the concept of non-sovereign futures, commented on the remarkable bravery of protesters in Puerto Rico when they called for the ousting of the governor without knowing what was coming next in the uprisings last year. This imaginative impulse is also central to prison and border abolitionist movements that are seeing a rapid increase of interest today. What's interesting in relation to this panel in particular is that I think Hong Kongers' imagination has extended to forms of collectivity and mutual aid that extend beyond the Western archetype of the nation state, which is a concept that has been foisted on so many places in Asia to violent and exclusionary ends. And so I think it's really interesting to see the ways in which different communities are articulating alternatives to this reality. So just in closing, in our analysis of Hong Kong's post-colonial condition and our participation in articulating potential decolonial futures, we at Lausan hope to continue to strive to understand our place in history and in the world and our responsibilities in mobilizing for a truly imaginative and decolonial future for all. And I'm looking forward to continuing this learning process with all of you in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wen Liu, sorry, thank you, JP, for such a, I'm just like already a bit, but yeah, thank you, JP, just now. That was a really interesting presentation, but I noticed that your slide was not moving, or were you meant to keep it the cover slide? So I tried reaching out, but it's okay, never mind. Maybe we could do something with editing, I'm not sure. But anyway, thank you so much. That was like really interesting, and it was a really progressive and radical, like drawing upon all this like amazing rich scholarship on political thought and kind of thinking about the situation in Hong Kong. And there's just so much for us to learn from, especially in Malaysia, where praxis is just like almost non-existent or just really subaltern to a certain extent. So yes, I see there's let's just go to the Q&A. So everyone here, please don't hesitate, don't be shy with your questions. And I have prepared some of my own in case there are not enough questions here, but so far there's one and it looks really good. So let me just read it out. It's directed to Wen Liu. The question from Claire Chang. How do you evaluate the new southbound policy in Taiwan? Do you see it bridging Taiwan with South countries?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's great. For me, we know the southbound policy really hasn't started under the Tsai's administration. So a couple of years back, I think from President Lee Teng-hui from the 90s have already really conceptualized this idea of going south. And I think my biggest critique of this kind of trade policy as a way of diplomatic relations is it often still comes with a more exploitative relationship with economies in Southeast Asia rather than a completely cooperative, equitable economy. So if you really think about what's really happening in Taiwan's economy, we have to think about how Taiwan itself has also treated Southeast migrants in Taiwan as well. And we know that there's a lot of injustice around how Taiwanese residents have viewed, non-Han Chinese, Southeast East Asian background migrants, and they're always under very precarious conditions, working conditions in Taiwan. So if our only cooperated relationship with Southeast Asian country is still a sort of a neoliberal trade deal, I won't think it's a sort of an ideal relationship, but I understand it's a way in which the current regime is trying to decoupling the economic ties with China, particularly. I think for me as an activist, I would advocate for Taiwan to start to see itself as part of the South. I think for a long time, like we have tried to be part of the Northeast Asia region, right? Trying to be the next South Korea or the next Japan, but obviously that's not really panning out so well for us. But really we have to think about us as an islanded country connected to other parts of Southeast Asian island and have some kind of more activist alliance in that way, rather than trying to be a successful capitalist economy that dominates Southeast Asia. So I think that'll be my first response to that question.
Okay, that's a really, really good answer to a really good question. And there are more good questions coming in. One from Yen C. My question to all the panelists is that a lot of the frames under which the world and even people in places in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and across sea understand politics are in terms of the state and nationalism, which are themselves reactions to colonialism and empire. From your discussions, this seems to be a limitation and even an obstacle to your work. How do you intend for people to understand and go beyond state and nation to look more at solidarity across space, ethnic, and other distinctions? PJ or JP, would you like to respond?
I'm happy to respond. This is actually something that New Narrative struggles very much with. When we started initially, we made a decision not to organize the site by country, even though we cover 11 or 12 Southeast Asian countries, depending on whether you consider West Papua its own country. And immediately we got a lot of feedback saying, please, can you sort by country? Because I want to know more about my country. And one of the things we want to do is really to try and tell stories about Southeast Asia, which reflect lived local circumstance and which looks at the region, sub-regions in ways which are relevant to the people of Southeast Asia, and thereby demonstrate the artificiality of many of those borders. In particular, we're trying to develop stories which are transnational, transregional, and which looks at solidarity in many different ways across borders and boundaries. So, I loved one of the last things that JP said, which was specifically about the nation state, which if any of you were in my presentation 2 weeks ago at the Singapore Literature Festival, I identified as possibly the biggest challenge facing Southeast Asia to decouple the nation and the state, and to at least critique that ideology which dominates our political imagination. It is of course incredibly difficult. I mean, Ian has put his finger on maybe one of, if you ask me, the biggest challenge that we face today. and especially the association of toxic nationalism and blind patriotism with the nation state. But I think the best way to do it is really to demonstrate how the possibility and the active existence of these alternative forms of collective identity, and to keep pushing them forward, and empowering people to then take action on the basis of that different possibility. And we have to remember the historical inevitability of changing of boundaries and borders. So I think it's human failing that we think that what exists now will always be, that's the way our minds work, right? What is now will always be. But the fact is our borders and boundaries are in a very long, slow process of being actively reimagined all the time. And we do need to take part in that discussion and ask ourselves fundamentally, if the whole point of polities is to create the best life, the best actualization, the best circumstances for the people inside it to thrive, then what are the boundaries, the borders, the forms of organization which best enable that to happen, and proceed from that argument rather than, often that premise, rather than the unquestioningly accept current boundaries and borders. Thanks.
I can also provide an answer. I think there are mainly, what comes to mind immediately is 2 points. The first one is related to a panel that was part of an earlier day of the Transnationally Asian Conference, plug for the video recording. But I think a crucial thing that people everywhere can organize around is around labor, and specifically an anti-capitalist material orientation towards resistance allows us all to, because essentially we all live under global capitalism and conditions of neoliberalism today, albeit kind of in local manifestations. Labor and issues of labor rights, unionization, exploitation, expropriation, they're all issues that kind of, regardless of the area or place you're living, there's going to be organizing and there's going to be people agitating, against structures of capital. And I actually think that this material orientation is crucial to any kind of real engagement with empire, because as people have already said earlier in the panel, you can't discuss empire and imperialism and colonialism without talking about the structures of extraction and expropriation that not only underlie current systems as a result of histories, but also continue to exist in the ways that, our political and economic systems continue to be organized at the ultimate expense of the most marginalized in our communities. The second point is around the idea, around the issue of militarization. And to this, I'll put the link in, but there's a really powerful piece that was written, an interview by a Taiwanese activist who lives on Jeju Island in Korea. And basically, the author talks about the ways in which Southeast Asia and East Asia in particular, because of the histories of imperial militarization on the part of the US, but also China increasingly, has created this rise in warmongering, war armament, militarization. And this actually creates, a situation of precarity for everyone in the region. Of course, everyone in the world, but everyone in the region in particular, because there are actual geographical sites of, weapons and armament building. And one of his suggestions for solidarities in that piece is that we need to build a kind of regional political community and awareness around the need to resist militarization, even though it might seem pragmatic in order to have like a military base in your backyard with an ally such as the United States that might come to your rescue. As Wen articulated earlier, this is a kind of ridiculous assumption, and one that's easily falsified by any understanding of history. But it's definitely, I think that piece really resonated with me because I think under conditions of the new Cold War in particular, in quotation marks, it's a real threat that I think is, in addition to labor, something that people across this region can organize around and resist against.
Okay, thank you so much for your responses. I'm going to move on to, there's a lot of questions coming in and they're really good, but I just wanted to pick this one out. And it's from Yvette, asking to talk more about how would we include and highlight the indigenous struggle in Taiwan, but I would like to also find out how that would be a question also in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And so, but since the question is directed in reference to Taiwan, so we'll start off with Wen Liu first.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I can't find it in the chat. So.
Oh, it says, can you please talk more about how to include and highlight the indigenous struggle in Taiwan?
So I'm trying to write an article right now to think about how, sort of relate back to the last question as well, that Taiwanese independence, we're thinking about independence as independent from the hegemonic narratives or assumptions from US empire and Chinese empire, but really is to situate Taiwan's struggle in an interdependent relationship with also the indigenous struggles on the island, and to see Taiwan's struggle as interdependent with other, Asia's regional struggle that's going on, like in Hong Kong, in Thailand right now, right? Because we know a lot of global struggles are always connected and inspired by each other. So I think in that approach, firstly, we can reject that assumption that once we reach a Taiwanese nationalism, then Taiwan will be complete, right? We know it's always an incomplete process, but only in its incompleteness, it can had this radical potential, right? So how do we connect more with indigenous struggle? So I also want to talk about how a lot of Taiwanese independence will set the priorities, right? The first is to gain national independence. Then we can talk about transitional justice. We can talk about migrant rights and whatnot. I think that's a completely false strategy, right? We have to really front and center what indigenous activists are telling us, because I think Joanna Barker, in her book called Sovereignty Matters, she talks about how indigenous notions of sovereignties not only expand or critique nationalism, but actually expand our assumptions about kinship, right? About gender and sexual relations, about our relationship with ecology and whatnot. So to centering on specific notions of indigenous sovereignty in different communities help us to expand even the very notions of nationalism itself, right? For instance, in Taiwan, I think I see a point in which the LGBTQ movement can really work closely with right now the indigenous struggles for their own recognition of a new way of doing gender, right? So that is sort of formulating in Taiwan right now. Or another one is to think about, the struggles around climate change and the kind of ecological damages on indigenous lands to a broader, let's say, what happened in Taiwan was the anti-nuclear struggle connected to Japan, right? So there's actually a lot of ways in which that our struggles can be connected if we really center our notions of movements and our resistance strategy in sort of localized indigenous notions of community, right, of interdependence. So I think that is really the key to change this growing Han Taiwanese nationalism that's happening. So, the specific details of the movement, I think we have reported some of the recent struggles, like I say, the right to hunt is one. that I think that more people should pay attention to. And also obviously the ecological damages, like when we have typhoons, usually what gets hurt is the indigenous community from the East Coast, right? But oftentimes the Han people live on the West Coast, don't really care about what's going on the lands on the East Coast, even though we're on the same island. So there's that kind of injustice or unfair relationship between the population. So I think that's really the first start, is to really pay attention to that struggle. And just the last point, I also want to say that during the 2014 Sound Falling movement, it actually created a platform, I think, for a new ideas about indigenous independence that come out. So it's a new notion that really challenged the mainstream way of thinking about Taiwanese independence, but to center on indigenous sovereignty. So it's not mutually exclusive. It actually work with each other.
Thank you. That's really comprehensive, and I think it also like another question. So maybe if I could get JP or decide how would these media in perspective the oh, can you hear me? Hello? Good.
Sorry, you broke up a bit. You're frozen. Your screen's frozen.
Hello?
Now.
Oh, okay.
Looks like you're back. Would you like to repeat what you said?
Oh, no. Okay, I'm here. Yeah. So I just wanted to tie in to another question about how your media organizations, Lausan and New Naratif, then would also disrupt conceptions of sovereignty, state, or even environment, right? And I was just thinking a lot about this book by Sunil Amrit, Crossing the Bay of Bengal, and how that's like a really genius way of bringing in that conversation, right? Because he's looking at how migrant workers are agents of environment, and this conception of the region is all kind of disrupted. And of course, it ties in back also to what you said earlier about boundaries constantly changing, right? And so I was wondering what both of you thought about that, just to continue Wen Liu's train of thought. PJ, you'd like to go ahead? Yeah.
I was going to invite JP to go first since I spoke first last time. So why don't you go first, JP?
Okay, sure. My thoughts are like organizing my thoughts. But I think like in terms of how Lausan seeks to disrupt the concept of sovereignty, I think the situation of Hong Kong is in itself is already an interesting position from which to critique sovereignty, because technically our sovereignty was kind of created by British colonialism, and then it was returned in 1997 to the CCP. And I don't know if there's any more beautiful an illustration of the fact that sovereignty isn't really first, it isn't real because arguably, Hong Kong people have never had sovereignty in the sense of being able to exercise self-determination because of the lack of kind of democratic, I guess liberal democratic, but just broadly democratic means of organizing their own societies and their own political structures. But I also think it just kind of highlights how even the concept of sovereignty and its presupposition of a exclusionary nation state is a very particular historical concept that's not natural or necessary as a form of political organization. And so, in Lausan, we're not only trying to unpack these kind of contradictions, but also suggest that actually, some people in Hong Kong are advocating independence in the sense of they want to become a nation state. But we're also trying to push back on this and critique this, because we're just trying to say, you know, sovereignty isn't all it's cracked up to be. And also it's a fake concept. It's not real. And we can aspire to more imaginative visions of the future that, you know, include, but also like stand in solidarity with and like ensure equal rights for people who might historically be excluded from the nation state. Like someone, an anonymous person asked about like Chineseness and the fact that we haven't really spoken about ethnicity in particular. This is why I think like the sovereignty concept, nation states, the necessarily exclusive nature of it precludes us from seeing migrant workers and migrants in general's struggles as one and the same as ours in terms of an anti-capitalist frame, which I think is important more so than an inclusive frame, like an inclusive sovereignty. I'm not really a fan of that. I would rather us just do away with the concept and just reimagine what else could be. But yeah.
I like JP's answer. That's actually a really good answer. For New Narrative, you know, what we try to do is we push the idea that sovereignty is individual, right? That nations are imagined, that nations don't actually exist, that they are simply collectively imagined and agreed upon. The only indivisible basic unit of human society is the individual, and so all sovereignty has to take place at the individual level. So if any person does not have their full democratic and human rights, then that is a failure of the system. That is a failure of us collectively as human beings to protect that person's rights. And that's the basis on which we proceed. And that's the basis on which we would like everyone to think of their societies, rather than to think of it on the basis of broader artificial imaginations. So I think we're running out of time, so I'll just stop there and we can take the next question.
Yeah, I think we've also run out of time. It's already 10:03. And the session's only for 1 hour, according to Mingxi from New Narrative. But okay, I mean, we have so many interesting questions. I wonder if we have time to take one more, if the panelists are okay with that. Okay. Okay, yeah, all right. So Promise from Lausan Collective said we have until 10:15. So that's the hard limit. So I'll just take like one more question. Okay, there's a lot going on here, and I'm wondering if there's anything like the panelists in particular would like to respond to. There's questions about Chineseness and questions about okay, maybe I'll take this one.
Well,
I think this
to respond to the point of Chineseness, actually, I viscerally hate being called Chinese. I'm not, right? And its attempt to pigeonhole me in a certain box, which I don't identify myself as, right? If I was a citizen of China, I would not be Han Chinese. My ancestors are Zhuang, but it makes no difference to me. I am a human being, not Chinese. And I think I viscerally respond very strong to that, because my whole life I've been told I'm Chinese in an attempt to pigeonhole me and force me to do things, you know, and force me to behave in certain ways, especially by my government, which I utterly detest, right? It's a mechanism of authoritarianism to impose these identities on us. So I'm very deeply uncomfortable with that. And that being said, I respect the spirit in which the question is being asked, and I think it's important to note that all of us, as someone else noted in the chat, that we have tried to bring forward a lot of different voices throughout this conference, and that all of us do try and bring forward a lot of different voices as well, but we cannot simplify or pigeonhole. What I do recognize about myself, for example, is not so much Chineseness, but privilege. I have a massive amount of privilege in many different ways, which are very complicated. And from that privilege, I need to unpack, I need to unpack what that privilege has given me, and from that, I have a lot of responsibilities to society. But it's far too complicated to be reduced to any one label. And this is part of the problem of, we think of, I can't remember who mentioned aggressive ethno-nationalism, to again, try and, the problem with trying to imagine it, that identity is, again, it just reduces people to labels that they don't necessarily self-identify with. So I think, to come back to my earlier question, we need to think about people on the basis of individual sovereignty, or as JP suggests, disposing of the idea of sovereignty altogether. Just think of individual human rights and democracy, and proceed on that basis. Yeah. Again, we're running out of time, so yes. Take the next question. Yeah.
Well, okay, I think we should just wrap up, but I'll draw upon a question from Ram Adimas Wasito, who, makes a reference to the iconic 1955 Bandung Conference. And so if I could have each one of you give your closing remarks, and on the basis of how could we create, sustain a very transnational movement that aims to disrupt the current bipolarity that governs the world today. Wen Liu or JP, one of you can go first. Hello?
I'll just quickly, I think, I think it's a great history to think about Afro-Asian solidarity. And obviously, I think some of what New Bloom and Lausan have also tried to do is to highlight how, the recent Black Lives Matter struggle have connected to our local struggles. And as folks may know, there's a lot of fractionism happening on, well, if we support Black Lives Matter, that means we're anti-America. If we're anti-America, that means we don't want to be an alliance with the US. So I think it's very easy for people to take that kind of dichotomistic position, particularly on this issue. But I think this particular issue shows that, what your true, social justice values are. I mean, what kind of communities are we fighting for? And it's also important for us to remember that I always say to Taiwanese activist friends that the US is also not, it's not homogenous, right? There are anti-imperialist faction, there's anti-racist faction, and to be anti-US imperialism doesn't mean that we don't work with US activism at all. So this may not be so connected to the original question on Bandung conferences, but that's how I'm conceptualizing a possible future of Afro-Asian solidarity, is to take that question of, the kind of struggles of marginalized communities really seriously, right, from different parts of the world, and to center race in our thinking. Because in a way, I think in Taiwan, we really don't have that conceptions of racial justice. We often separate people between the Han Chinese versus the indigenous. That's the only, or the Taiwanese versus the Chinese. We don't have a conception of racial justice. But in this kind of era of global pandemic, we've learned that we need to develop our own discourses of anti-racism and a critique of anti-Blackness. Because if not, then we're totally sidelined from the global struggles right now. So this is what I would say for now.
Yeah, I think, like, similarly to what Wen said, any kind of, resistance work that attempts to build transnationally, the first step is always going to be unpacking and, undoing the mentalities and colonial structures that kind of already lead us to have presuppositions about the way we organize, and also kind of embedded oppressions and ways of thinking that are already embedded in our minds by our education. And I think it's a really important point to emphasize, because so many of the structures that we're resisting against are global. And, you know, you can't talk about kind of imagining a decolonial future without thinking about the ways in which anti-Blackness and capitalism and imperialism are intrinsically linked. And so how can we resist that structure from our specific locales, even though, as we saw from kind of some Hong Kongers' responses to Black Lives Matter, it may not be immediately obvious how we kind of, our city, you know, plays a role in that structure. Just in regard specifically to the Bandung Conference, I think it's an incredible archive and historical event in building third world solidarity. But I think that this may be a bit, I think I have some hesitations about romanticizations of kind of manifestations of third world solidarity that are based on kind of still within the framework of nation states, and, you know, led by kind of elite leaders. Not to say that that conference was, but just, I think today, because of the binaries that exist and have historically existed about, you know, conceptualizing certain places as necessarily, you know, socialist or necessarily like capitalist, that actually has, in Lausan's experience, constrained our solidarities and ways of building with one another. And I think that, you know, a more productive way to think about it is to just kind of mobilize in solidarity with communities that we know share anti-capitalist, anti-imperial, anti-colonial values, and not necessarily constrain it to a nation state frame as may have previously existed. Because I think, as we're seeing, like, especially with the internet and like, you know, modern technology, it's possible to connect with people on the ground who have lived experiences without the mediation of kind of government or structures, you know, institutional structures. And so that's kind of, I think it's possible to make connections with people just in ways that wasn't possible before, and so necessitated kind of those institutional structures. I don't think we need those as much anymore. And so, you know, we can do a, you know, not transnationally Asian, but like, you know, a similar type of exercise like this, but a lot broader, and it's still possible within our current means.
That's just brilliant. I really appreciate the critique, and I think all of us here do. And we could go on and on discussing, because, you know, there's so many contestations on the practices and ideas, and it's ongoing as, you know, circumstances are changing. And it's also our idea of like the state and the ebbs and flows of like globalization is continuously transforming, especially given that we are in a pandemic as well. So we are still, you know, having to confront new questions. And so thank you everyone for engaging very vigorously with this conversation, and hopefully we continue beyond this panel, and it could be in the form of writing or more panel discussions or among your friends at a coffee shop. Who knows? But yes, let's keep this conversation going, and let's disrupt and interrupt that relationship with empire. So let's wrap up. And I would just like to thank New Naratif for inviting me to moderate this conference and to be acquainted with such brilliant people from across the world, not just you know, within Southeast Asia. So thank you, JP of Lausan Collective. Thank you, Wen Liu of New Bloom, and thank you, PJ of New Naratif. This is the final panel for the Transnationally Asian Conference. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and please stay up to date on the social media platforms of New Naratif, New Bloom, and Lausan Collective for the recordings and future events. So bye-bye.